Good afternoon, professor and classmates. Welcome to our academic debate on bilingualism, cognition, and language acquisition. Today, we will discuss the following question: Does bilingualism provide more cognitive and linguistic benefits than challenge? Our discussion is based on the scientific evidence presented in DAMS 10 and 11. Throughout this debate, we will analyze research by Costa and Sebastian Gales, Paradis, Volterra, and Tischner, Genesi, Maisel, Salibi, Troy, Apple, and Moisken, among others. Rather than simply expressing personal opinions, we will compare theories, evaluate scientific evidence, and defend our arguments respectfully. Let's begin with the Pauti.
Thank you. Our team believes that bilingualism should be understood primarily as an advantage rather than a limitation. One of the first ideas that caught our attention while reading Team 10 was that many people assume bilingual children become confused because they are exposed to two languages. However, Costa and Sebastian Gales explain that the belief is not supported by research. Also, bilingual infants must learn to phonological system, to vocabularies, and to grammatical system at the same time. They gradually develop much mechanism that allow them to distinguish both languages successfully. Instead of seeing bilingualism as a source of confusion, we think it is more acquired to view it as evidence of the brain's remarkable capacity to adapt. In our opinion, this is one of the strongest arguments supporting bilingual education.
Okay, I agree that Costa and Sebastian Gales present a conviction evidence, but could you like to ask the pro team something? And in bilingualism is mainly advantages how that explain the bilingual effect, describe later the team 10, and where the second language can influence on the first one. From our perspective, bilingualism train bring benefits, but also create additional cognitive demands. The material explained that bilingual adults may retrieve words more slowly than the first language, nor transfer grammatical structure from their second language. Therefore, while bilingual children successfully acquire two languages, we should also recognize that managing two linguistic systems requires constant mental effort. For this reason, I believe that bilingualism should be a complex process rather than purely positive one.
That is an excellent question. However, we think the bilingual effect actually reinforces our position instead of weakening it. If bilingual speakers constantly need to select one language while inhibiting the other, then their brains are constantly exercising executive control. Costa and Sebastian Gales even suggest that permanent language management contributes to greater cognitive flexibility. In other words, what initially appears to be a challenge may actually become one of the reasons bilingual individuals develop stronger cognitive skills. So rather than interpreting the bilingual effect as a disadvantage, we see it as evidence that bilingualism promotes cognitive development.
I would like to connect this discussion with the theories we studied. Well, reading them, then I noticed that research have changed their explanation over time as new evidence become available. For example, Voltaire and Tischner proposed the unitary system theory, suggesting the bilingual children initially process only one linguistic system. Later, research such as Genesi and Marshall challenged that idea by proposing the dual system theory, arguing that children are able to distinguish between both language from the beginning. And however, I would like to ask to team another question. If bilinguals really have two completely independent language systems, how can the dual system theory explain code switching, where bilingual speakers naturally mix both language in the same conversation?
This is precisely one of the main criticisms of dual system theory. Will explain its grammatical difference between language. Is cannot fully explain why bilingual people switches naturally from the one language to another, because of the limitation researchers proposed the three-party system theory, which introduced the idea of sharing systems together with separate language systems. And however, after student team 10, we also realized that triple theory failed to explain other important phenomena. Essentially, select language that loss of difference recovery patterns after brain injury. Therefore, although each theory contributed to values, ideas, and nothing completely explain bilingual language organization.
Exactly, and that is why I believe paradise substance theory represents such as an important step forward. According to Paradise, every language functions as an independent subsystem within one larger language system. Personally, I found this explanation much more convincing because it explains both language independence and language interaction. It also explains why one language may remain intact while another is affected after brain damage. Unlike previous theories, this substance theory seems capable of integrating most of the most available evidence instead of explaining only one part of bilingual behavior.
Listening to both teams, I think this discussion demonstrates something very important about scientific research. One thing I learned from these units is that scientific theories are not simply replaced because they are wrong. Instead, they evolve as researchers discover new evidence. The progression from unitary theory to the subsystem theory clearly illustrates this process. Every theory solves certain questions but also reveals new limitations. In my opinion, this is one of the most interesting aspects of studying bilingualism because it reminds us that scientific knowledge is always developing. However, I would like to ask both teams another question. If the subsystem theory is currently the most accepted explanation, do you think that the debate about bilingual language organization has finally been resolved?
Not completely. Even though Paradis' proposal explains more evidence than previously theories, Team 11 shows that researchers are still investigating how bilingual languages are represented in the brain. For example, Apple and Musken explain that bilingual language systems are neither completely separate nor not completely fused. This suggests that bilingualism is much more dynamic than we original thought. Therefore, we believe that subsystem theory is currently the strongest explanation, but scientific research should continue exploring this topic.
I completely agree with the point. Another section that really caught our attention was the discussion about cognition. 11 team explained that bilingual individuals constantly activate both language and even when a speaker only one. This continuous activation appeared to improve executive control and cognitive flexibility. And however, soluble trochee remind us that advantages are influenced by several variables and including age or acquisition, language pontifice, and language dominate. Therefore, instead of saying the bilingualism is automatically improved cognition, and it is probably more accurate to say its effect depend on each individual experience.
Excellent discussion. And before we conclude, I would like to introduce one final topic. And how does the evidence about brain damage and language recovery support the theories we have discussed today?
According to Marrero and later analysis discussed in the 11, recovery after brain injury is highly variable. Some bilingual patients recover both language simultaneously, others recover one language before the other, and some even experience temporary loss of only one language. Mitchell Paredes also described different recovery patterns, including parallel selective, differential, antagonistic, successive, and blended recovery. Personally, I think these findings strongly support the subsistence theory because they suggest that bilingual languages are interconnected, will still maintaining a certain degree of independence.
I agree. In fact, this section convinced me even more that bilingualism cannot be explained through simple models. In both languages function exactly the same way inside the brain. Selected language recovery would be extremely difficult to explain. Instead, the evidence suggests that bilingual language organization is both integrated and independent, exactly as Paradis proposed. This demonstrates how neurological evidence can strengthen linguistic theories.
After listening to both perspectives, we conclude that bilinguals it's much more than the ability to communicate in two languages. Research by Costa and Sebastian Gales demonstrate that ability children successful acquire two linguistic systems despite the additional complexity involved. Like with the progression from the unitary theory proposed by Volterra and Teichner to Paradis subsystem theory illustrates how scientific understanding has evolved as new evidence has emerged. We also learning that bilinguals influences connection executive control language processing, and even language recovery after brain injury. At the same time, researchers such as Savile Drake, Apple, and Muskin remind us that these effects depend on factors such as proficiency, age of acquisition, language exposures, and neurological organization. Therefore, rather than viewing by bilinguals as a simple advantage or disadvantage, we believe it should be understood as a dynamic cognitive process that continues to challenge research and expand our understanding of how the human brain processes language.
Thank you very much for your attention.